Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. It's been a while. This is episode 100, I think. And it's been a while. Most of the animals are in here. The sun is getting low. I might be running out of light pretty soon. But I do have this project that I've been thinking about having to do with the Rainbow Circle. And I might just hash it out on video. I don't know if that's a good idea at all. Probably not. But it has to do with a couple of my obsessions. One of them is behavioral economics, which I think is really fascinating. I mean, I came up with the Rainbow Circle idea just in direct response to what I thought were some false ideas in understanding how fiction worked. And I think a lot of the false ideas are very similar to what behavioral economists would identify as false ideas. But I would identify a different sort of diagnosis. I've talked about this on previous episodes. This is episode 100, and it's been an obsession of mine for a while now. So, of course, I've talked about this before. But if you look at the origins of behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, people like that, one of the things they identify is System 1 and System 2 operations. System 1 is that automatic instinct. I would associate that really with the middle of the rainbow circle. And I would argue that's the most important thing to really optimize and focus on and enhance in the creative process, is that gut-level instinctual response to a story or a piece of art of any kind. System 2, I would associate that with the outer rim. Going all the way to the outer rim, you have that rational, the rational universalization, shifting into the rhetorical, that sort of thing. I think a lot of the misconceptions about how fiction or any sort of art works comes with the false rationalization, which you might call post-rationalization. What I would call post-rationalization. I think Rory Sutherland is where I got that term from. Another behavioral economist. But I think a lot of the misconceptions come with, some sort of breakdown in translation between the two. So I'm thinking of a system to understand this more closely, or more intimately, more carefully. This is the system I'm considering. If I can get it all in the shot. There you go. Let me shift this around. There you go. So in fiction writing or in any sort of storytelling, I'm going to talk about Taylor Swift in a second. So this includes music. In comics, I've been thinking about, using comics as examples of this, pretty extensively. Wrestling also, there are lots of really interesting examples there for sure. But if you start off with the pure visceral response, which is an entirely valid sort of system 1 response to an art piece. In art, it's very positive. In economics, it can be very negative. It can lead you into some really bad decision making. And Daniel Kahneman, talks about that too. He says, this is not something to treat dualistically as a good and a bad. This is just understanding how the mind works in order to, recognize why people might make irrational decisions, irrational economic decisions. But in artwork, irrational responses are totally valid, very positive thing, definitely the sort of thing. Of course, my entirely irrational animals are going to knock everything over any second now. So we want irrational decisions. We love them. We celebrate them. They are great. In the economy, not so much. So a lot of the times in behavioral economics, they tend to be discussed in order to create things like nudge interventions. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein talk about this idea where you're not forcing someone to make, to change their decisions. You're just sort of shaping things to recognize their pure visceral responses and shaping things so that they make better decisions, which is manipulative. But, it's just one of those things that they talk about. And a lot of times they talk about that forming into cognitive biases. big part of behavioral economics that they talk about. Thinking of them as cognitive biases tends to give the impression that they're unchangeable, that if you have a bias, you just have to shape your presentation of, like a product. Behavioral economics talks a lot about products. And so if you think about an art piece, shape your presentation of an art piece, recognizing what their cognitive biases are, recognize, they're more than likely unchanging cognitive biases that are deep in their subconscious. But you shape the presentation of your product, or whatever sort of paperwork you have or what have you, in order to more effectively lead people to better choices, which is one of those ironic sort of ideas in behavioral economics. You're manipulating people to make better choices. But I would argue that the more significant part of that is the post-rationalization, but also the part of that you could really focus on and change, arguably, is the post-rationalization. Because going from these deep-level visceral responses to these post-rationalization, that leads to fallacious arguments. And I would argue this is where you can change things more effectively. But I was thinking of, if I ever get around to completing any of these topics as like a study or a presentation, Taylor Swift's song "The Man" reminded me of Becky Lynch, "The Man." So I think a comparison of those two might be really interesting comparison. But if you look at "The Man" by Taylor Swift, I mean, you can apply this to pretty much any Taylor Swift song, but if you look at "The Man" by Taylor Swift, the whole premise of that is if she were physically a man, she would be the man. But if you look at how powerful and prominent she is in the music industry, it's hard to imagine a performer with more power. I think a lot of what she's talking about is, other forces in the music industry that are, powerful and misogynistic. Certainly producers and things like that. If you look at the broader scope, certainly she deals with a lot of misogyny. But if you just narrow your focus just to who's the most powerful performer in the music industry, it's hard to imagine someone more prominent, more powerful, more popular. A few might come to mind, but she's clearly in the upper echelons of that. But still, her perception is that she has this limitation on power based on her gender. So you could break down that whole situation. I mean, if the in behavioral economics they talk about interventions, nudge interventions, changing perceptions, manipulating cognitive biases and things like that in order to make some change, some positive change. So what is at the source of her perception? So just going into it, you just recognize that just in responding to "The Man" by Taylor Swift, there is potential to respond to it with some of these cognitive biases. So one, and I'm trying to coin some because I'm a fiction writer. I like coining things more so than I like coining and creating more than learning. But one of them that you can, one of them that I was thinking of was the cognitive bias of competitive tragedy. So if you look at any Taylor Swift song, you can easily just say, what does she have to complain about? She's wealthy. Why could she possibly be sad? And that's a dehumanizing perspective on anybody. I mean, I if the goal is, I would say, the most effective sort of intervention in the recognition of someone's misery, inequality. I mean, any sort of negative thing in the world. Give the whole basket of negative things. Step number one, empathy, treating someone as a human being, giving someone subjecthood, giving someone agency. That's the ultimate goal. All those things are really tied together. So if your first response is, how could she possibly be miserable if this girl would sit still? I'm trying to reduce your agency because you're so fidgety and you're getting in my way. Otherwise, have all the agency you want. But so if you go into a situation like that and you say, what does she have to be miserable about? She's wealthy and powerful and popular and all these really positive things in her life, so she has nothing to complain about. That is a way of dismissing empathy. Taylor Swift has been very effective in eliminating that to a significant degree. Just very early on in her career, when she was very successful, she would still have all these miserable songs. And you could have easily dismissed a lot of what she wrote as saying, what does she have to be sad about? She's wealthy and popular and all that sort of stuff. But I think at the root of that, here's the key. At the root of that is your pure visceral response to her song. So if you hear her song and you like it, then you don't have more than likely, you don't have the post-rationalization of competitive tragedy. More than likely, what you would, sort of response that you have would be just very positive. The recognition that she's rich and popular and all that sort of stuff. That recognition does not become an obstacle to appreciating her songs. So the pure visceral response of pleasure in hearing her songs and emotional deep level empathy with her songs does not then lead to the fallacy of competitive tragedy. But if on the pure visceral level, for no really rational reason whatsoever, you don't like her songs, and it's entirely valid to say, I don't like her songs. The problem of something like the fallacy, the cognitive bias of competitive tragedy, that comes into play once you try to explain why you don't like her songs. So it's entirely valid to say, I don't like her songs. I do personally, but it's entirely valid to say, I don't like her songs. And then the post-rationalization then would be, I don't like her songs because, and unnecessary, but once you fill that in, it starts to develop into a cognitive bias. That's the post-rationalization. The post-rationalization is, here's my explanation of why I have this pure visceral response. So it develops into this cognitive bias. That person has nothing to complain about because he or she is rich and powerful and all these positive things. That becomes a block to empathy. So if you intervene in between and validate, this is the key, arguably, validate the lack of necessity to explain the pure visceral, irrational response and say, just celebrate the idea. I don't like that song because I just don't like that song. There's no real reason for it. Then that, cuts off the post-rationalizations. And I think a lot of why she's successful, why she's able to overcome, like the post-rationalization of competitive tragedy, and still, no matter where she is, she's still able to make people feel things, is her capacity to enhance the empathetic experience. So I think, I haven't talked about the paradox yet. Paradox is key. So any sort of emotional experience that enhances the empathy of the audience, arguably will have a paradox just at the core of it. Just the nature of empathy really requires paradox, because you're feeling something somebody else is feeling. And so I think when it comes to the idea that celebrities are these ideals that we're achieving, that they have, reached some level of perfection, it's a false idea that we like someone because we want to be like them in an idealistic sense. Much more effective is the paradox of vulnerability. The paradox of vulnerability means, somebody may be tough and confident and all that sort of stuff, but also simultaneously, vulnerable and emotional. So if you think about, this is one of the keys, I would argue, I think last time I talked about Taylor Swift, this is what I talked about, that she'll have a song about being tough and shaking things off, and this sort of idea of she doesn't let critics bother her, but ultimately, paradoxically, those are songs about how critics really do bother her. But I would argue that that's something that makes her appealing, is her capacity to manage that sort of paradox of being very powerful, being very vulnerable at the same time. And that might be, one of those things that I would say that whole idea of the paradox of vulnerability is really key to understanding a lot of how all of this really works. Because the whole idea of the man, I were a man, I'd be the man, is the notion that she would be able to achieve this, she'd be able to eliminate this vulnerability. She would eliminate, any sort of criticism of her behavior, any sort of criticism or belittlement of her behavior. And whoever she's responding to, it might be just trolls, it might be people within the industry who just, will claim that she's not worthy of her success or what have you. So she'll have these sort of, tough songs of not caring what other people think. But also she'll have, if you recognize that those songs are working on two levels simultaneously, that sort of enhances the song. Her sense of vulnerability manifests into a sense of toughness, and her sense of toughness manifests as a sense of vulnerability. But she'll also, just over the course of multiple songs, she'll have songs that that communicate her idealistic view of love. Her earlier songs especially, her heartbreak, all of these really super vulnerable, intensely emotional things. And so she'll have, across the span of songs, she'll have, super vulnerable songs, and songs where she cares too much and songs where she doesn't care at all. But yeah, and so that's part of what enhances the empathy is, and that seems counterintuitive, and that's one of those things that you talk about a lot in behavioral economics, is what makes a particular celebrity appealing. Rationally, it would be functioning as this ideal of coolness and toughness and lack of care. I think, if you look at somebody like Frank Sinatra, one of my favorites, he's this idealistic level of cool. There he is right there. This idealistic level of cool. But what makes him appealing is his vulnerability. And I would argue that, I have Dorothy at the top here too. I would argue that applies to Dorothy too. Superficially she's vulnerable, but she's extremely tough at the same time. But that's a common sort of paradox that you can see in enhancing empathy and making a performer or a character very appealing. But if you flip that around, arguably that's a lot of the obstacle to being the man that she experiences, where you'll have the post-rationalization of categorical entrenchment. I think I've talked about that before. which I think is one of the most harmful and virulent sort of post-rationalizations there are. So if you think about why a man might be resistant to recognizing the power of a woman in any context, whether it's, Taylor Swift clearly has this huge amount of power in the industry and popularity and money and all these different really positive things. What keeps her from perceiving the power that she does have, the perception that because she's a woman, she can't actually achieve this power. But if you flip that around and you say, how could someone possibly say Taylor Swift does not have this huge amount of power? And you tap into the root of a lot of, the misogyny just over history. And I think a lot of it is vulnerability, but resistance to vulnerability. So, the dualism, reverting to dualism. Here's my rainbow circle again. The center of the rainbow circle is non-dualistic. The perimeter is dualistic and hierarchical. It's a bit of a mind-blowing thing to think about, but that's really key to the rainbow circle. Non-dualistic, dualistic. Two sides of a spectrum. That's kind of how you can have something be dualistic and non-dualistic simultaneously. But with non-duality, you're feeling something someone else is feeling. The necessity is that you make yourself vulnerable to the feelings of someone else. So you make yourself vulnerable to being hurt by an empathetic experience with a Taylor Swift song, for example. But just in a vast history of this cultural poison of misogyny, what is at the root of that response? If a woman has power over a man, the sense is the man is vulnerable and inferior, and that triggers that deep level vulnerability. If you're able to accept that vulnerability and accept the validity of that vulnerability and embrace it, then it doesn't become a problem that you're made vulnerable by someone else. But if you respond to that vulnerability through something like dualistic categorical entrenchment, you would say, this woman is making me vulnerable by making me an inferior. My post-rationalization is that dualistically, this category is superior to this category, therefore we must enforce that. And that's in the post-rationalization. That's so if you talk about the cognitive bias, hold on. If you talk about it in terms of a bias, the bias is that women are inferior to men. And thinking of it as a bias and as a deep-seated subconscious force, thinking of it as just a pure visceral response that women are inferior to men, that makes it less changeable. Whereas if you think of it as a post-rationalization, if you recognize that it's a failure in translation of a visceral response of vulnerability, it's not that someone has this unchangeable belief that women are inferior, it's that someone, arguably, although this is arguable, it's that someone has this deep-seated counter response to vulnerability in order to eliminate vulnerability, and interprets it in this extremely harmful way. If you recognize vulnerability as being the source of that, you can then encourage the person. This could be sort of like a nudge intervention. You can encourage the person to accept vulnerability, accept irrationality, and that, I think that's a lot of reason why we have this incessant need to rationalize irrationality, is because irrationality can make you feel vulnerable. At the perimeter, keep bringing it back and forth. At the perimeter of the rainbow circle, that's the destimulating end of the spectrum. You have the stimulating end of the spectrum that's non-dualistic, and the destimulating end of the spectrum. And a lot of what really fuels the destimulating end of the spectrum is need to eliminate any sort of feeling, any sort of vulnerability. It's a deep-seated survival instinct. I used to call that the survival drive. I don't think that's really, the most descriptive and accurate term for it, but I think that's a lot of where it comes from, is the drive to eliminate any sort of vulnerability that you might have. So if you feel fear, just as a really basic example, if you feel fear, rationally you're going to eliminate the source of fear in order to not feel the fear. But in an artistic context, you want to enhance that fear. So you want to recognize that impulse to either eliminate the fear or post-rationalize away the fear and explain it rationally in order to reduce it. So that's sort of the push and pull. And I'm not saying this is the only solution to misogyny. I'm just saying diagnosing it in this different way gives you a different sort of method. I mean, thousands of different methods to combating misogyny, but thinking outside of the box and rethinking just the core of it and the source of it, recognizing rationality as maybe the obstacle to eliminating the problem, or realistically not eliminating the problem, but reducing the problem. Then you can look at, I would say, androgyny is one of the key things that is really fascinating to me in the the man concept of Taylor Swift's song. And that's one of those things where sort of I would say the default base assumption. I mean, this is where the rainbow circle runs counter to some of the taken for granted concepts in the history of culture and gender and all this sort of stuff. I would say the default, androgyny is the default. It's right there, right there at the center. If it's non-dualistic, the core is androgynous. It starts to bifurcate into genders and settle into these, settled concepts of gender towards the perimeter when it becomes more dualistic. So that's why I have this fascination with gender-changing characters like Ozma from the Oz series, like Orlando by Virginia Woolf, but also characters who challenge those really rigid gender lines are really fascinating, like the whole concept of the Man music video. So challenging those sort of gender norms, those taken for granted concepts of really rigid gender distinctions. I keep accidentally saying gender. Those rigid concepts of gender distinctions, like Taylor Swift does, like Becky Lynch does by calling herself the Man. Those really trigger that sort of visceral response that and I'm reminded certainly of when this happens in comics, like when it happened with Thor, when Thor became Jane Foster. There was a intense, virulent, negative response to the idea that Thor had to be a man. Thor is an entirely made-up character created by human beings. Why does it actually matter what gender he is at all? But you had this really virulent response, which is, it's the fascinating... I'll have to make a whole other video about Becky Lynch, but that's the fascinating thing about Becky Lynch calling herself the Man and main eventing WrestleMania 35. Very little negative response. From what I could tell, especially, I pay a lot of attention to comic book and wrestling podcasts and things like that. This ridiculous and embarrassing negative response to things like Jane Foster, Thor, and it's a great story. Arguably, all that really should matter is that it's a great story. But, it's a storytelling form. What actually does matter? Does it matter that what gender an entirely made-up character is? Of course not. But, compare that to the response to Becky Lynch, and it was arguably, from what I could tell, from an anecdotal perspective, of course, entirely the opposite. But and I think Taylor Swift has been conscious of this from the beginning. Her first single was called Tim McGraw, which I think was a brilliant sort of. Whether or not she did this on purpose, I have no idea. Probably she's very intelligent. That's something underappreciated about Taylor Swift. Very smart business person. Very, very intelligent person. Like when Love Story came out and it was a questionable interpretation of Romeo and Juliet, I gave her the benefit of the doubt and I said, maybe she's doing that on purpose and maybe she's compromising the integrity of the song in order to show just how warped the concept of the song Love Story actually is. So she's essentially communicating the opposite. I always give her the benefit of the doubt because she's a very, very smart person. An aspect of her that's totally underappreciated. But I think when Tim McGraw came out, she was 17. I'm probably still just as smart at 17. I don't know, but Tim McGraw, the whole idea of that one, if you think about behavioral economics and these sort of manipulative tricks that they come up with, here's a brand new artist named Taylor Swift who has a song called Tim McGraw. Somebody just reading through a list of songs, not thinking too much, will say, that's a song called Taylor Swift by an artist, by, a very well-known artist at the time, Tim McGraw. So I think she was doing that, from the very beginning is, challenging those gender norms in a way. Even though a lot of her songs, very heteronormative, of course, but at the very least, that first one was challenging that idea of that rigid sort of separation between genders, and sort of mashing herself up, this brand new female artist with this well-established male artist. If that it was intentional, I will give her the benefit of the doubt and say it was a brilliant nudge that she came up with. But anyway, so this is kind of just a concept that I'm hashing out loud. The whole idea. So if you think of this sort of a sequence, the paradox in terms of the androgynous sort of playing with supposed taken for granted gender norms, really ties with those other sort of compelling paradoxes of vulnerability and vulnerability, that sort of thing. And that enhances the empathy through sort of tricking the subconscious into accepting vulnerability. All that stuff works really positively and is really effective. And you can respond to androgynous characters with a post. There's this really rigid separation that must occur between genders. But having an androgynous character sort of short circuits that. Ideally, not always, of course. But I think in the case, those examples that I just mentioned, short circuits that sort of post-rationalization, sort of fools that post-rationalization into accepting the vulnerability more effectively. So it doesn't end up, becoming that sort of fallacy. But if you compare that to ones where there was a really negative backlash, like Thor, for example. Not that we have any obligation to take that kind of backlash seriously. I'm not saying there's any validity whatsoever to that backlash. I'm just saying, recognizing the level of backlash, analyzing why there was this backlash here and not this backlash here. The level of with Thor, the level of association with just intense masculinity, then very suddenly becoming, and especially with Jane Foster, she's extra vulnerable because she has cancer. She has all these different qualities. It was this very extreme sort of shift from hyper-masculine character to this much more vulnerable sort of a character. Great story, worked really well on the story level. but for many people, why was there this backlash? So, if you look at the root of, certainly Taylor Swift, who is one of the most powerful and popular and, all beloved performers, not with everyone, of course, there's plenty of backlash. She also gets a lot of backlash. Why does she get backlash? If you break that down and analyze that, why does she get so much backlash that she responds to that through this sort of gendered sort of concept of saying if she were a man, she wouldn't get this sort of backlash. What sort of post-rationalization is she functioning with, and what sort of post-rationalization are her critics really functioning with? If you break both of those down, you can recognize what sort of nudge intervention really you can really effectively insert in a situation like that in order to eliminate the backlash, or to, unless that's what you want, I don't know, which is totally fine. It's a totally valid sort of response to that sort of situation. If you say, well, the backlash is just a bunch of trolls, I don't really care if trolls have this backlash or whatever. Entirely valid. I validate that completely. But let's say you want more of a easier acceptance, if that's what you're interested in, an easier acceptance of, a particular concept, a story, a song, or something like that. How can you recognize the role of the visceral response and the post-rationalization in acceptance, in the acceptance of it? But I think that's the basic idea. So, the key being the acceptance of empathy and acceptance of irrationality. I would say that's one of the most basic and arguably one of the most effective nudge interventions, if you want to call it that, is to validate irrationality, validate vulnerability, and say, it's okay to feel a certain way. That's the storytelling fallacy. I was just listening to a lecture about that. That's the storytelling fallacy, the idea that if you have a poster and then you have to explain why you like this poster, that eliminates your actual satisfaction with the poster. So rationalization is counterproductive to appreciation. So to eliminate the necessity of rationalization and say, validate, I like this because I like it, and that's all I really need to say. I dislike this because I dislike that, that's all I really need to say. Doesn't necessarily have to have an explanation like, I dislike this because here is a category that must always be true. That's the sort of post-rationalization people will fall into. But anyway, I will form this into a more reasonable and focused and orderly, maybe, more orderly sort of concept one of these days. But anyway, I'll see you on the next episode.